In 2021, control of the country of Afghanistan fell into the hands of a radical Islamist group known as the Taliban. They were able to make a rapid advance across the country, establishing control over Afghanistan's various provinces until they made it to the capital city of Kabul. This came after foreign military forces that had been present in Afghanistan for almost 2 decades, including the United States military, withdrew from the country and in some cases even had to make a hurried exit, leaving weapons and gear behind as the Taliban started their advance. The coalition of military powers led by the U.S. had reached an agreement with the Taliban in 2020 following a bloody campaign wherein the group deployed guerrilla tactics over the course of several years. The agreement stated that U.S. troops were to withdraw from Afghanistan and the Taliban would commit itself to participating in national peace talks. These peace talks would never take place, however. Afghanistan's own military collapsed during the Taliban's advance, and a number of the country's government officials who had been previously supported by occupying Western countries were forced to flee alongside the foreign military personnel and other anti-Taliban allies. It only took a few weeks for the Taliban to regain control over Afghanistan, something they hadn't achieved in over 20 years. The return to power caused the country's economy to implode, meaning a vast number of Afghan citizens were left struggling to find enough money to access necessities like food and water. The international community is still waiting to see if the group plans to honor their agreement that led to the withdrawal of the external military forces, including whether or not certain human rights will be enforced under the Taliban's rule. Now, for a lot of people in the Western world, especially if you grew up predominantly in the early 2000s, you're likely to have already heard a lot about the Taliban. Even if you grew up in more recent decades, you still probably learned of their existence at an early age, especially if you live in countries like the United States or the United Kingdom that had an active military presence in Afghanistan since 2001. But even if you've heard them mentioned before, you might still be at a loss as to who exactly the Taliban are and why their recent rise in power in Afghanistan is such a pivotal moment in not just the history of that country, but the history of the entire world. So let's take a look at who the Taliban are and how exactly they were able to come to power. Afghanistan, the place where the modern Taliban draws its roots, is a country that has a long history of being invaded by foreign powers. This has often given way to internal conflict between factions that form within Afghanistan itself. In around 329 BC, the country was conquered by Alexander the Great. Many centuries later, Mahmud of Ghazni would become one of the next in a long line of people to invade and rule Afghanistan. He was an 11th century conqueror who commanded an empire that spanned from Iran to India. Not even 2 centuries later, Genghis Khan, the big daddy of all conquerors, would take control of the territory in the 13th century. Eventually, in the 1700s, Afghanistan was unified as a single country, and by 1870, Islam had become its most widely practiced religion. The word Taliban itself roughly translates to students of Islam or seekers of knowledge, and the existence of the modern-day group can trace its earliest roots back to this. Centuries ago, these early Taliban were unlike those we know today, lacking any of the ties to Islamic extremism that are now often associated with the word. During this time, the Taliban were part of what's known as the Quran Belt, a region of Afghanistan near the city of Kandahar, where the practice of conservative Islam is known to be quite prominent. They were very often teachers and mediators and would provide comfort to those who were dying. Many would live on donations and the kindness of others as they engaged in religious studies, with the goal of becoming mullahs, members of either the Shia or Sunni Muslim clergy. The formation of what we know today as the Taliban, interestingly, comes as the result of a lot of earlier parts of Afghanistan's history. Think of it as a row of dominoes being toppled, one event or action causing another, with that then leading to yet another part of the story. So to fully understand where the Taliban came from, knowing the history of Afghanistan can offer us important context. By the time of the 19th century, Great Britain had long established itself as an empire across the world, and it would retain that influence over these territories overseas for quite some time. From their imperially controlled base of India, the British attempted to expand their power into neighboring Afghanistan, invading the country in 1839. At the time, Britain and their empire were in stiff diplomatic competition with the Russian Empire, looking for areas to strengthen their influence in South Asia. The British invasion of Afghanistan was intended to oppose Russia, presumably because the British felt that the Russians expanding their empire into Afghanistan posed a danger to their empire in nearby India. However, the invasion of Afghanistan by the British Empire led to a series of conflicts known as the Anglo-Afghan Wars. This all started when the British installed Shah Shuja as the Shah or King of Afghanistan. Shah Shuja had previously been king and had formed an alliance with the British during this time, only for him to be exiled and spend many years unsuccessfully attempting to regain the throne. When the British reinstated him as the Shah, the Afghan people weren't too happy about it, to say the least. They wouldn't tolerate an occupation by a foreign power or a ruler who had been installed by them, and as a result, insurrections broke out against the British and Shah Soja. He was eventually assassinated when the British occupation force withdrew from Kabul in 1842, and the Afghan people were victorious. However, the British would send another army to Afghanistan as retribution for the forces they lost, with the Second Anglo-Afghan War eventually beginning in 1878. This resulted in a British victory, after which they occupied Kabul and established a permanent embassy there. Then the same would happen a third time following the end of the First World War. The ruler of Afghanistan at the time, Habibullah Khan, maintained a policy of non-involvement throughout the war, but there was growing support for the Turkish Ottoman Empire's resistance to the British. After all, given their bloody history, the Afghan people had pretty valid reasons to dislike the idea of British rule over them. When Habibullah Khan was assassinated in 1919 by people associated with the anti-British movement, his son took control of the throne and declared Afghanistan's independence from Great Britain. This sparked the Third Anglo-Afghan War, where the British were defeated in 1921. This is when Afghanistan became truly independent, and their Emir Amanullah Khan felt that their repeated conflicts with and occupation by the British had set their country back, causing their development to be behind that of many other parts of the world. So the Emir began a rigorous campaign of socioeconomic reform to get the country back on track. In 1926, he declared Afghanistan as a monarchy instead of an emirate. An emirate is a territory ruled by an emir, which is the title used by monarchs who rule over a Muslim state. Within an emirate, the emir holds ultimate power over the government, but may have their authority constitutionally limited. In an absolute monarchy, however, the monarch rules as an autocrat, meaning that they have full control over the state and government, even down to imposing laws and punishments. And in the case of the now king, Amanullah Khan, he wanted to limit the power of the Loya Jirga, Afghanistan's national council. Not everyone was on board with these changes in Amanullah's policies, and in 1928 and 1929, his frustrated critics took up arms in retaliation. This forced the king to abdicate the throne and flee the country. Then in 1933, a new king, Zahir Shah, was crowned. This heralded a more stable period for Afghanistan, lasting over the course of his rule for the next 40 years. In 1934, Afghanistan was eventually formally recognized as a country by the United States, and this marked the start of what would become an ongoing turbulent international relationship between the two countries, one that would even directly lead to the formation of the Taliban. As we mentioned before, all of this is one big line of historical dominoes, and heading into the Second World War and beyond is where they start to fall more and more rapidly. Following the end of the Second World War in 1945, the British, who still occupied and controlled India as part of their empire, withdrew and granted the colony independence in 1947. India had long desired independence from Britain, and their own armed forces had now become strong enough to reject the imperial rule. This then led to the partition of the colony, resulting in two states, India, which was predominantly Hindu but secular, and the Islamic state of Pakistan, which shared a border with Afghanistan. That brings us to the era of the Cold War, a state of tensions between the United States of America and the USSR. These two opposing nations had been pivotal in defeating Nazi Germany in World War II, and that victory had transformed both the Soviet Union and the US into formidable global superpowers. But with their increased geopolitical power and greater influence over the world, their ideological differences led to a constant struggle between the two to accumulate more arms, wealth, and power than the other. Of course, with the creation of the atomic bomb and both countries' access to nuclear weapons, neither could engage the other in armed conflict, although the unsettling threat of that occurring was ever present at the time. With neither the US or the USSR acting directly against each other, they were forced to oppose each other through more indirect means, such as proxy wars or backing governments that aligned with their own interests and opposed their adversary. That brings us back to Afghanistan and to a man named General Mohammad Daoud Khan. He wasn't just a cousin to the king of Afghanistan, Zahir Shah, but also a firm supporter of the Soviet Union. In 1953, Mohammad Daoud Khan was made prime minister. He introduced a lot of pro-Soviet policies, as well as educational and social reforms, such as allowing women more of a public presence in Afghanistan, enabling them to attend university and enter the workforce. Given his ideological and political similarities with them, Daoud Khan would look to the Soviets for economic and military support. This would result in the Soviet premier at the time, Nikita Khrushchev, agreeing to aid Afghanistan, bringing the countries closer. Daud Khan would eventually resign from office of prime minister, and any future political influence he may have had was stifled by a new constitution that prevented members of the Afghan royal family from holding any political office. Then, in 1973, Daud Khan launched a military coup that would depose his cousin Zahir Shah from the throne. Instead of assuming the role of monarch, Daud Khan abolished the monarchy entirely. He installed himself as the new president of Afghanistan, and his regime, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, took control. Declaring the country a republic, Khan established firm ties with the USSR. However, despite his attempts to modernize the new communist state and force his opponents out of the government, Daud Khan's control over Afghanistan would eventually be toppled when he was killed in 1978 during what became known as the Sour Revolution. In secret, Afghanistan's own Communist Party had been steadily growing ever since the mid-60s, under the leadership of Babrak Karmal and Nur Muhammad Taraki. After the revolution successfully brought the Afghanistan Communist Party into power, Taraki became the new president, with Karmal alongside him as deputy prime minister of the new Democratic Republic of Afghanistan after Daud Khan's death. Even though they were backed by the Soviet Union and maintained friendly relations with them, Taraki proclaimed his new policies would offer Afghanistan independence from Russian influence and were intended to enforce Islamic principles and Afghan nationalism. However, many saw through his assertion. Around that same time, Iran had undergone its own revolution too, which led to an extreme militant form of Islam spreading. Sharing a border with Afghanistan, the same militarism reached conservative Islamic leaders in the countryside, who had also objected to the social changes implemented under Daud Khan. Emboldened by the influence from Iran, these supporters initiated an armed revolt to stand up against the Soviet-backed Afghan government. They viewed a number of the policies introduced under Khan and later Taraki and Karmal to be oppositional to traditional Islamic practices, such as improved civil rights for women in Afghanistan. So, as their militant revolt grew into a larger insurgency, the Mujahideen were created, a group of Islamic rebels who were the almost immediate precursors to the modern Taliban. The Mujahideen were formidable, opposing the communist Afghan government with various kinds of violence. Given their ties, the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan would witness a Soviet intervention in their country that pitted the USSR's military force against the Mujahideen, beginning in 1979. Around this time, the country's American ambassador was killed, leading to the US cutting off support to Afghanistan. An ongoing rivalry between President Taraki and another influential communist leader, Hafizullah Amin, resulted in Taraki being killed by some of Amin's supporters. This is largely what triggered the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan to bolster the country's communist regime, as it ideologically aligned with their own. With Amin and many of his followers executed, Babrak Karmal was elevated from deputy prime minister to president, and this, along with the Soviet presence, led to a number of violent public demonstrations. Given their opposition to the Soviets and the USSR-backed government of Afghanistan, this rallied the Mujahideen to band together, going from individual pockets of rebels to a united guerrilla group. In the early 80s, millions of Afghan citizens were forced to flee to the neighboring countries of Pakistan and Iran in order to escape the fighting between the Mujahideen and the Soviet troops. At this point, the conflict had garnered the attention of other countries around the world who also opposed the Soviet Union, but couldn't directly engage them given the international tensions of the Cold War and the threat of nuclear retaliation. So instead, the United States Central Intelligence Agency began to discreetly offer support to the Mujahideen insurgency, as did Great Britain and China, going via Pakistan to provide arms to the rebels. And it was this action, driven by an ideological opposition to the Soviet Union, that led the CIA and other countries to support groups that would later form parts of the Taliban. It was also around this same time that Saudi Islamic extremist Osama bin Laden made his first documented trip to Afghanistan, aiding anti-Soviet fighters and eventually forming the group known as Al-Qaeda. For them, the battle against the Soviet Union's control of Afghanistan was a religious holy war, or a jihad. The influence of the USSR over the country opposed their goal of a nation that was governed solely by the religion of Islam. Claiming their initial major victories against the Soviets, Al-Qaeda was also aware of the US supplying arms to the Mujahideen, viewing the influence of yet another global superpower as an obstacle standing in the way of establishing an Islamic State. By 1989, the Soviets were on their back foot in Afghanistan and eventually withdrew in the wake of peace accords between them, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the United States. The goal of those accords was to secure Afghanistan's independence, and as around 100,000 Soviet troops departed, a power vacuum was left in their wake. Multiple Mujahideen groups, including Al-Qaeda, were vying to seize control over Afghanistan from the communist president at the time, Dr. Mohammad Najibullah, who had been elected in 1986 and was a puppet of the Soviet Union. It was because of this that their fighting continued beyond the Soviet withdrawal, with Mujahideen still seeking to overthrow the USSR-backed Afghan regime. And then, in the early 90s, the group we now know as the Taliban emerged. They were a predominantly Pashtun movement, Pashtun being the largest ethnic group in Afghanistan, many of whom also resided in Pakistan. The word Taliban is even a Pashto word, meaning students, and they preached a hardline form of Sunni Islam. In 1992, Mujahideen were able to storm the Afghan capital of Kabul, despite them rapidly beginning to fracture into various splinter groups led by warlords fighting over the country's future. At the same time, Pakistan's Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto sought to develop Pakistan's economy via trade. Her interior minister was a notable Pashtun figure and had even organized guerrilla training for the Afghans during the 70s. She organized a convoy into Turkmenistan, which arrived at the Pakistani border as the student movement of the Taliban had just started operating. Pakistan's Inter Services Intelligence Agency supported the previously unknown movement, and this allowed them to push into Afghanistan. Many remaining Mujahideen fighters would join this new movement and eventually formed the Islamic military force known as the Taliban, founded by an Afghan militant named Mullah Omar. They were able to rise to power under promises of restoring peace and security to Afghanistan, as well as enforcing their own version of Sharia law, the laws that form part of the Islamic tradition. However, the Taliban's interpretation of Islamic law included enforcing corporal punishment for offenses such as adultery, false accusation of a crime, drinking alcohol, and theft. For many Afghan citizens who had suffered during a long period of ongoing wars and the effects of the Mujahideens fighting after the Soviets departed, the stability that was promised and the upholding of traditional Islamic values were reasons enough to support the Taliban. Initially, they received widespread support as they were all seen to be stamping out crime and corruption in Afghanistan, allowing the areas under their control to flourish. In 1995, the Taliban captured the province of Herat, which bordered Iran, and within a year, they had captured Kabul, overthrowing the Mujahideen's leader, President Burhanuddin Rabbani, who had resisted the Soviets. While the United States refused to recognize the authority of the Taliban, the extremist group went to work. They enforced Islamic law through public executions and amputations, walking back many of the country's more modernized laws, including preventing women from participating in education and forcing them to remain veiled and stay indoors unless accompanied. Internationally, the militia was condemned for massacring Afghan citizens, discriminating against religious or ethnic minorities, denying food supplies from the United Nations to their own starving civilians, preventing women from obtaining jobs, and overall restricting the rights of the Afghan citizens living under their rule. The Taliban also banned television broadcasts and music, as well as stopping girls attending school beyond the age of 10. The United Nations accused the Taliban of committing various human rights abuses, given their uses of execution, beating, and detaining journalists, and even their own Afghan citizens if they protested for their own rights. As well as this, they were accused of abusing other cultures. In one now notorious incident in 2001, the Taliban destroyed the famous Buddha statues in Bamiyan, central Afghanistan, despite international protests against the action. To the Taliban, the acknowledgement of other cultures was an affront to their own Islamic culture. It's worth noting that also during this time, Osama bin Laden was widely believed to have been hiding in Afghanistan during the same time period he was declared an international terrorist. He cultivated thousands of followers through terroristic training camps. However, he was the figurehead of Al-Qaeda, not the Taliban, though he would become part of the Taliban structure. The principal difference between the two groups was that Al-Qaeda sought to fight an international jihad with the goal of imposing Islamic law on a global scale. The Taliban's objectives were more localized, wanting religious control over Afghanistan alone. Pakistan denied having any hand in the creation of the Taliban, despite there being many Afghan citizens who fled to Pakistan in the 80s and then joined the growing movement after being educated in religious schools in Pakistan. By 1996, the Taliban controlled roughly 3/4 of Afghanistan, although they were opposed by another militia group known as the Northern Alliance, who seized many northern areas of the country and fought against the Taliban's control. They would maintain their stranglehold until December 2001, when the United States would launch their invasion of Afghanistan. This occurred as a direct result of the attacks on the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001, perpetrated by Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. Since the Taliban had refused to turn bin Laden over to the U.S., despite him hiding in Afghanistan at the time, U.S. and British forces initiated airstrikes against Taliban targets, attacking their various bases believed to be connected to al-Qaeda. The Taliban were then faced with intense fighting against the Northern Alliance, who were able to enter Kabul in November of 2001. The retreating Taliban forces fled to Kandahar, their hold over the country rapidly dwindling. Although the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan seemed to signify the end of their rule, the remaining Taliban forces would soon launch an insurgency against the American forces and the newly instated Islamic Republic of Afghanistan that ruled the country with the U.S. backing. The United Nations would launch a multinational military effort to fight against the Taliban, known as the International Security Assistance Force. The conflict that then arose between the Taliban and this combined effort by countries like America, the UK, France, Germany, and many more NATO members became known as the War in Afghanistan. Since the Taliban had refused to extradite bin Laden without evidence of his involvement in 9/11, they were now active participants in a conflict of a massive scale. Members of the Taliban were driven out of areas of Afghanistan that the U.S. military took control of, which were predominantly major population centers, driving them out to the more rural provinces of the country. While their primary target, Osama bin Laden, relocated to Pakistan, the coalition of armed forces led by the U.S. remained in Afghanistan, with the express intent of aiding the creation of a new democratic authority to run the country. However, by 2003, the Taliban had reorganized under the leadership of their founder, Mullah Omar. They then enacted a widespread and bloody insurgency against the coalition forces, as well as rejecting the authority of the new Afghan government. Fighters loyal to the Taliban engaged in asymmetric warfare, meaning their military strengths differed greatly from those of NATO forces. They employed guerrilla tactics in more rural areas. These were often attacks that involved a small group of irregular militants, such as rebels, paramilitary, or armed civilians loyal to the cause, instead of authorized military personnel serving a country. They would conduct violent ambushes in the countryside and then deploy bombing attacks within urban areas, including targeted assaults against anyone they perceived to be working with the newly established government, the Islamic Republic. A lot of notable events took place over the course of the war, including the killing of Osama bin Laden in 2011 in Pakistan. But this didn't prevent the Taliban from taking control of large parts of Afghanistan. Bin Laden's death did prompt NATO leaders to begin planning their forces' exit from the country. However, it would take a further 10 years for this to happen. The war in Afghanistan eventually culminated in 2021 after 2 decades of fighting between the Taliban and the combined NATO forces. The duration of the war was longer than the Vietnam War, albeit only by around 6 months, making it the longest armed conflict in U.S. military history. Given that they were unable to eliminate the Taliban through sheer military strength, the coalition attempted to change up their approach and engage with the Taliban diplomatically. This effort resulted in a U.S.-Taliban deal being struck in 2020, which stipulated that the U.S. troops would leave Afghanistan by the end of the following year, thus signaling an end of the 20-year conflict. The Taliban pledged in return that it would prevent any militant group within its territory from staging or conducting any attacks against the U.S. or any of its allies. However, the Afghan government rejected the terms of this deal, given that it was made between the U.S. and the Taliban rather than between America and Afghanistan. At the same time U.S. troops were due to leave, the Taliban staged a massive offensive strike throughout the summer of 2021, and this led to them re-establishing control over the country. They seized the capital of Kabul once more on the 15th of August, causing the last president of the Islamic Republic, Ashraf Ghani, to flee from Afghanistan in fear he'd be executed. Within 2 weeks, the final United States military aircraft departed from the country, and now America no longer had a military presence in Afghanistan. The war was officially over. The war in Afghanistan cost the lives of well over 200,000 people over 20 years, almost a quarter of which were civilians killed in the crossfire. The result was an overall Taliban victory, allowing them to rise back into power, which they have managed to hold till the present day. Now check out what actually went wrong in Afghanistan, or watch this video instead.